This is Seattle University's Presidential Speaker Series, and now your host, Eduardo Peñalver.
Thank you all for being here this evening. This is the first installment of our second season of this speaker series. We created this series last year to support a culture of civil discourse and disagreement on the Seattle University campus. And since we first started this a year ago, we've seen campuses around the country come under even more pressure and scrutiny, especially after the conflict erupted in Israel and Gaza. Now this year, we've got a presidential election approaching in a few weeks that promises to be among the most divisive and consequential of our lifetimes. And so discourse on campus will come under increasing pressure this fall, no doubt including here on our Seattle University campus. And that pressure will pit our Jesuit values against our Jesuit values and our desire to maintain a productive educational environment against our interest in maintaining space for freedom of expression and civic engagement. And we'll have to navigate the conflicts and contradictions between those various values, all of which are important to the success of a university. It's never been more difficult to explore this space of campus discourse, but I think also never more important that we do it. And that's what the series is about. And so this year, we're going to be focusing on two intertwined topics that relate to the health of speech on campus. One is viewpoint diversity on campus broadly and its impact on the educational environment. And then the other is the impact of social media on the health of our discourse and on the preparedness of the members of our community to engage in it. And this evening, we're delighted to welcome Johns Hopkins political scientist Stephen Teles. In November, we'll be hearing from Yale Law School professor and also political scientist Keith Whittington. After the new year, we'll welcome social psychologist Jean Twenge, who wrote the sort of definitive book on the impact of social media and technology on Gen Z. And then rounding out the series for us in the spring will be Columbia Law professor and former Facebook advisory board member Jamal Green. So I hope you can make it to all four of the talks, but many people can't. And if you can't, this year we decided in response to feedback that we got last year from people who were disappointed about not being able to attend these to record them, and then we'll release them as podcasts after the editors do their magic on that. So be on the lookout for information on those. Obviously, none of you will need them, although some of you might want to go back and recap tonight. But if you can't make it to a future one, there will be recordings that are available. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Stephen Teles is a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Economy and Society at Johns Hopkins. He's also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. Is that
close enough?
Okay. A nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on immigration, climate, and social policy. He's the author of 5 books, including The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, which is how I first came to know of his work. It's an amazing book on the conservative legal movement. I definitely recommend it if you're interested in the Federalist Society and how it came into being, or law and economics. And The Captured Economy, and he has a recent book on Never Trumpers. It's called Never Trumpers, right?
It's called Never Trump.
Never Trump. His work's been featured in a number of outlets, including National Affairs, The Public Interest, Democracy Journal, American Prospect, The Nation, Washington Monthly, and others. Professor Teles, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So in a recent piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, you wrote, and I'm going to quote, that the public's impression that American higher education has grown increasingly close-minded is undeniably correct. And as a faculty member, the focus of your piece was on the professoriate, and as you put it, at Johns Hopkins, I would be hard-pressed to name a single tenured professor in the social sciences and humanities who is openly right of center in any reasonable understanding of the term. So a couple of questions, like what's the basis for those claims, and what do you see as the problem with that?
Yeah, so let me start by telling a story which is my own story. So I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia started in 1989, and I considered myself a slightly, centrist but liberal, and I had the good fortune to study with three really titanic conservatives, and this was a transformative experience for me, not because they converted me, but because they pushed me. They didn't let me get away with stuff. I remember getting, paper after paper, where they would note that I was trying to steal a base. There was a thing where I was supposed to be demonstrating, but I was just sort of asserting something that for me was a kind of orthodoxy. And they forced me to take note of that, right? They didn't force me to believe what they believed, but they forced me to give the strongest argument for the position I was taking, or to rethink the position I was taking. And the thing that really drew me to write this article, which I did, I thought a lot about whether I had a PowerPoint that I had written that it was a talk that this thing, that became this article that we're talking about tonight, that was sitting on my computer for 3 years, because I wasn't sure I actually wanted to go out and write this piece that was going to be, critical of a lot of academia. But I did think a lot about the fact that it was hard for students at any major, especially research university, to have the kind of experience that I had. And it was impossible for anyone to have it at Johns Hopkins, my own university. So I spent a lot of time trying to think about whether I wanted to have that line, and how the president's office would take having that line be out there. But, surveys of the professoriate, which, all of them have some issues, have shown a general leftward move every year in the professoriate, to the point where the part where you could call the conservative has in most universities gotten almost entirely lopped off, right? Those people are retired and they didn't get replaced. And, to the point now where people like me, who still consider themselves liberal, are the right of the university that I'm at, right? I mean, that is, I can look in the mirror and have whatever identity I want to imagine myself having. But when I look around, I just put us all in a distribution. I am about the rightmost faculty member at my university, even though I'm probably at the 70th percentile of liberalism in American society, right? And in all the surveys especially in the humanities and social sciences, but interestingly, even in the natural sciences now, we've seen an increasingly a move to the left. And that's not so much because of what they study. It's not because, people who are doing particle physics, have this really lefty version of particle physics. It's that something about the kind of communities we have created have self-selected people who, not necessarily the ideology of left liberalism, but the culture. There's a culture of left liberalism that's distinct from the ideas, right? Lots of things that are just parts of how people go about their daily lives and what they eat and how they communicate, and the culture of interaction is sort of reproduced the ideology of a certain kind of set of the community, and has drawn people into our vocation and is sort of self-selected out. And I meet lots of young conservatives who would be great professors, or at least would have a chance of being great professors. I meet them all the time, and they all tell me that they've just concluded that academia is not for them. It doesn't want them. And I feel like that's a kind of tragedy for reasons we can get into in a second.
Yeah, your story about your experience at UVA is so interesting, as it maps really well with my own experience in law school. If you asked me the professor who had the most profound impact on me, it would have been Bob Ellickson, who was my property professor.
It was going to be either that or George Priest.
Yeah. No, I never took Priest, but Bob Ellickson, who was, a very conservative law and econ scholar at Yale, and really inspired me to study property because I disagreed with him so profoundly. But I just want to, I'm curious, the same concerns when you think about the leftward drift. I guess I have two questions about that. One is, and I think I know the answer to this, that this is different than the perennial complaint that universities have always been left wing, right? I mean, this something different is going on over the last 30 years than was going on in the 60s when conservatives were attacking universities for being too left wing. Is that consistent with your view?
Yeah, well, again, I'll just pick a couple of institutions, right? So, Harvard, which, obscure trade school in Massachusetts. In my discipline in political science, in the 60s, in that period, would have had Harvey Mansfield, James Q. Wilson, Sam Huntington, a whole, of people who are in my field are really considered to be titans, right? And the overall institution was left of center, but there were a number of major people, right, who you could go, you could have gone and studied with, and a lot of people I knew who did, right? It was possible to think about places like that as a place where conservatives had a place, right? Not necessarily the dominant place, but they had a place. And I think that's what's really changed. Is Harvard government department has nothing like that anymore. Yale doesn't. Princeton, they hired Keith Whittington away by Yale Law School, so now it's just basically Robbie George at Princeton. And so I think the difference, again, is if you imagine this as just being a bell curve, right? And you move the curve over so that part of the curve just dropped out, right, and disappeared. I think that's really what's happened. It's not that universities were ever predominantly conservative, right? It was that there was a large enough critical mass that there were people who could mentor conservative students, including graduate students, which is something I think is a really important, when you get to the question of why does anybody care about this, right? There are people who could directly mentor students like that. And that now is decreasingly true at lots of both elite institutions and at liberal arts colleges.
Do you think the same phenomenon is true, and does it generate the same concerns among, say, administrators or students?
Yeah, well, I mean, in part, these things sort of filter down. Now, part of it is, the administrative stratum of every university has gotten bigger, right? And that's I've for a while tried to figure out where all that's coming from, and it turns out to be the result not of like one cause, but a lot of causes, right? But that part of the university at most universities is simply way bigger than it used to be. It looms much larger over the experience of students, and they're mostly trained by a track that's separate from those that the academics and departments are trained in, right? And they often come with a different kind of ethos, right? It's often a more therapeutic ethos as opposed to a scholarly, right? It emphasizes things like harm in a much more of a way than we do in scholarly disciplines. And so I do think that's a genuine concern, and it has a different set of causes than what's going on in where the faculty is concerned. And I think it is happening with students, right? That we see generational changes. One of the questions is, are the changes in universities the causes of the changes in the composition of the student body, or are they a result of the fact that students are coming in already fairly different for generational reasons? And I don't know that anyone's quite figured that out, but I think it does affect things like what goes on in classrooms, right? Again, if you think about that segment of faculty, right, 10 or 15% of faculty can affect the overall discourse on campus, right? Because people, in part, just know that their arguments are going to get met by Bob Ellickson or George Priest or someone. And I think the same thing is true on student bodies, right? If people think they're going to be the only one who's going to be making an argument, almost nobody is really that heroic, right? Neither of us are probably that heroic, or the people who are likely to come from a pretty odd segment of the psychological distribution, and therefore I think there are reasons why people have stereotypes of conservatives, which is partially that the ones who are willing to put their head over, out of the trench are likely to be a very idiosyncratic group of people, not necessarily representative of the larger group of people who have some set of conservative views.
So in addition, you kind of divide the world into progressives and conservatives, but then you introduce a group in your Chronicle piece that you call the liberal institutionalist. And I was hoping you could explain what you mean by that, why you think that group is important to the intellectual life of the university.
Yeah, so I've actually spent a lot of time trying to problematize our ideological categories. And so I didn't love that this piece ended up becoming focused about simply the problem of conservatives, because I think that's really the part of the iceberg that's right above the water, right? And we can see by the fact that there's so little of that. When we think about the ideological character of universities, there's the longer term distribution is there's always been a tension between what we might think of as liberals and left, right? And I actually think that, especially in academia, liberals often have a very different conception of what the institution is for than those to their left, right? Who often have a very different sense of what a university is for, what the relationship is between scholarship and the overall vocation of the university. And again, institutions like this have a somewhat different definition, and we should actually talk specifically about how this filters down to Jesuit institutions, which I've thought a little bit about. And so I think a liberal institutionalist as people who've got a primary commitment, right? Again, the noun is institutionalist and the adjective is liberal, right? Institutionalist is that their noun is that they believe that universities exist for a distinct purpose, right? A purpose that is in some ways distinct from the political purposes that are outside the university, right? Our primary purpose, institutionalists think, is the creation and transmission of knowledge and the training of critical students. And our liberalism is a modification of that, and that usually what it makes you a liberal institutionalist is that you think your institutionalist values should trump your ideological values, right? And that part of that is also a belief that the university should be a pluralist institution, right? That we don't exist for partisan or ideological purposes, but we exist that we're best, right, when we have conflict, right? Part of the principle of scholarship is that conflict is good, right? Conflict is generative. I always describe this as the fact that when you combine the scientific method and motivated cognition, right, you get the kind of conflict you need for scholarly discovery. Right? That is, one reason why we want people who have different normative values, liberalism, left, conservative, is that ideally those things can correct each other, right? People have to have a motivation to go and run people's models, right? And to check their footnotes and to, in the absence of that ideological conflict, we can get sloppy, right? And I think what makes you a liberal institutionalist is we have a commitment to that general theory of where knowledge comes from, and the fact that to get that, we need both the scientific method and the methods of the other humane disciplines, and we need enough diversity that we get the conflict that causes people to ask tough questions and keep their institutions from simply becoming an extension of the ideological or partisan conflict that exists outside the institution.
Can the liberal institutionalist perform the role that you were describing earlier on in your experience at UVA? There is a kind of pluralism between the liberal institutionalist and the left, as you described it. Can the liberal institutionalist carry the weight of generating the kind of conflict that pluralism is supposed to generate at a university?
People keep asking me to do it. I'm not at university, right? So I was mentioning some of those functions that, that conservative faculty often do for students, like mentorship, right? So I get a lot of conservative students who are coming to me because they want to imagine a career in public service or other things. And, there's a lot of things that we do beyond just reading books with students, right? We recommend them for internships. We give them advice, right? Those are things I can do because I happen to study conservatives, so I know them, and I socialize with lots of them. I have lots of those relationships, right? But mostly those are things that are easier to do if you're in fact part of that community. And so for the most part, there are liberal institutionalists who can do some of that. But, all of us have different kind of social relationships that are connected to our identities that allow us to do mentoring for students of various sorts that we can always try to do somewhat for people who are outside of that. And we can always try and do as good a job as we can do. But, one of the reasons why many of us, including me, believe at least in some degree of affirmative action is we think that's really important, that our faculty be able to provide some of that mentorship directly that come out of some of our identities. And I think some of that argument weighs very heavily in favor of some degree of ideological diversity as well.
So you adverted to the difference between Johns Hopkins and a Seattle University in terms of institution type and to some extent mission. So let's talk about that. Is having a conservative faculty more important, or maybe the full pluralism, the full contingent of pluralism of faculty more important at an institution that's more focused on research than on teaching? Should it matter for a more secular university than a religious university, a Jesuit university?
Yeah, so when I think about why it is that ideological diversity matters, some of those concerns weigh more heavily on some kind of institutional types than others, right? So when I think about the function that's about correcting error in the production of original research, right? I think that's a really important function, right? We've seen all kinds of these problems in what people in psychology call the replication crisis, and a number of people have argued that that's a result of insufficient conflict, especially inside the field of social psychology, right? That there's basic questions that any conservative who's well trained as a psychologist would be asking, and that would have corrected at an earlier stage, and that other people would have wanted to try to replicate a lot of those studies earlier, simply because they found the findings abhorrent, and that's often what causes people to go and do that. So I think that motivation weighs much more heavily on institutions that are primarily focused on producing knowledge, right? And so at my university, Johns Hopkins, we prize teaching. Teaching's very important, right? But when you look at the little thing they give you that tells you how much to weight research and teaching in promotion and tenure, it is what it is. The other one, which I mentioned, which was mentorship, right? I think that's going to weigh much more heavily at a liberal arts college, right? And the part about being in a classroom and having the experience of having somebody who pushed you out of your comfort zone. And that's a lot of what, I've taught at multiple liberal arts colleges. I taught it at Holy Cross, Jesuit institution before. And that was a really important part of what they thought the vocation of the institution was. And there were a couple of conservatives, or actually more than a couple, and the faculty at Holy Cross. They were sometimes in tension with the SJers there, but I think they were very important to that kind of institution. And I think in maintaining the idea that there's something different between what we're doing and what the political conflict outside of our walls is, right? I think the diversity inside the institution helps people remind people that we're doing something different than political parties and ideologues are doing.
Right. So at Seattle University, we have our mission statement calls on us to empower leaders for a just and humane world. And I just wonder how our commitment to justice interacts with this question of pluralism and viewpoint diversity. Maybe to be more pointed about it, does hiring a conservative or does providing a venue for conservatives undermine our commitment or suggest that we're not serious about that commitment?
Yeah, so, Jesuits are called to be men and women for and with others. And it's worth digging into a little bit what that means, right? how does one succeed at actually being a man and woman for and with others? It's not always obvious how to be for others. We have principles, right? We have principles of social justice, but those principles of social justice are not self-constructing, right? We don't always know, right? What does it mean to serve the poor, right? Does building more housing, building more market rate housing, is that in the service of the poor or not, right? Those are actually problems that require an enormous amount of sophisticated social theorizing, empirical knowledge. A goodwill is not sufficient to act for and with others. And so that's where I think having a degree of ideological diversity can force us to actually ask the really hard questions that come when we try and figure out, especially when we don't have infinite resources, when we have to do this versus that, right? Should we build more market rate housing, right? Should we allow people to have, historic districts where nobody can ever convert their house into a multi-unit building, right? Is that in advance of social justice, right? How do you know until you actually do research? And that's why, again, normative thought and normative reasoning and empirical reasoning of the kind that often conservatives are very good at doing. You would go back to the example of law and economics, right? A lot of law and economics was designed to do was to force people to think really seriously about consequences, right? And, doing social justice is a combination of having the right normative principles and having an understanding of what happens when you try and actually actuate those in practice. And so that's why I think even an institution that puts social justice at the center, we still have to actually think really seriously and hard about what things will actually produce social justice or what will actually produce the opposite, even though the justification for them seems to be justice seeking.
Yeah, housing is such a great example because it's so complicated, the dynamics of the housing market. And it's just kind of autobiographically, it's an area where I found myself kind of over time more and more influenced by some of my libertarian friends. Ilya Somin, who teaches at George Mason, is this really hardcore, maybe, I don't know if you interviewed him for your Never Trump book.
I did.
He's a Never Trump conservative. Hardcore libertarian on property rights. And we'd spar a lot about this issue. And then over time, just kind of become convinced that the conservative legal economists were right, that single family zoning is probably one of the biggest obstacles to housing affordability in most cities, especially in the West. And the progressive movement's starting to catch up with that, but that was a kind of empirical insight that they developed earlier.
And I think when you look at the history of that, and this is something I've thought a lot about, there's a chapter on housing and the captured economy. We have a housing program at the Niskanen Center. So I've thought a lot about this issue, and it really was conservatives who were making the argument originally about the problems with zoning. You go all the way back to Milton Friedman. He was making a critique of zoning. More recently, Ed Glazer, the economist at Harvard, had been making this through the very conservative Manhattan Institute, and a lot of the people who are some of the most important, mostly left of center people on housing, like my woman I've worked with, Jerusalem Dimsis, who's at the Atlantic. She read all these Ed Glazer. Somehow she found these Ed Glazer articles, and they convinced her, even though she's continued to think of herself as a left of center liberal, that in part, people who were liberals, right, had gotten their material interests mixed up with what is in fact good for social justice, right? There's lots of people who are liberals who live in places like where I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, or in Seattle, or in other blue places, whose material self-interest is very much in not building more housing, right? And have often, made arguments that, don't stand up to reason about, why in fact actually building more housing isn't really important for getting housing costs down, right? Even though at some point you're arguing there with gravity.
Yeah. The law and economics is, and this, I'm trying to remember in your book whether you talk about this ambivalence of it, right? I mean, it was a movement that was very much supported by people like the Olin Foundation as part of an effort to bring more conservatives into higher education. And they've created these Olin centers all around the country. But then you have, the movement itself has broadened to such an extent that there are very left-wing people who consider themselves legal economists, including my judge Guido Calabresi. But in a sense, it succeeded. They succeeded in spreading law and economics throughout legal education, but failing in making it a sort of conservative beachhead. Although many legal economists are conservative.
Although I do think that one thing that did, and this is probably relevant for some other questions we're going to ask, including about these new schools that are being created in a lot of red states, right? It did create a place in which the arguments of conservatives were part of the distribution, right? So eventually, right, at Yale Law School, somebody like, Bob Ellickson or George Priest was arguing with Guido Calabresi, but they were arguing about something that for all of them was recognizably economics. And, people didn't think that the idea of being a conservative Yale law professor was just sort of, conceptually incompatible, right? And I think that's one of the things, that's one of the larger problems is increasingly conservatives and being professors, that vocation is increasingly seen as being somewhat just identity incompatible.
So let's talk about that. I mean, since faculties, this is something you cover in your piece, the sort of inertia of faculty identity, right? And this is true. This is true whether we're talking about racial identity or intellectual approach, right? But also in terms of ideology to a certain extent, faculties tend to reproduce themselves over time. Everyone's looking out for the next generational version of themselves. What can universities do to increase viewpoint diversity? What do you see as the tools in the toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you think about this as a kind of production line, it's hardest to start at the end of the production line, right? With the part where you're out there hiring professors, right? Because the professors you've got to hire are the results of everything else that came earlier in the production line, right? They're the people who go to graduate school, the people who get to the end of graduate school before that, the people who are in undergrad, and the professor, tapped them on the shoulder and said, you're really smart, you should go to grad school, right? That whole process, right, is the thing that ends up getting you the faculty that departments can hire, right? And so I do think there's a lot of things we can do all the way at the end of the process, but you're really pretty far behind when you're working there. I think, in the long term, over the 10 or 15 year scale, we really need to start working on how universities like mine, and I'm actually doing some work on this at Hopkins, are recruiting grad students, right? Because for the most part, people who apply to graduate school sort of self-nominate, right? They look in the mirror and they either see a future professor or they don't. And increasingly, they're looking at the existing students who are in grad school and saying, am I like them, right? And our grad student population, we don't have great data on this, but I think our grad student population has gotten further and further to the left, to the point where now the identity of being a graduate student in social sciences or humanities is ideologically coded. But I think there's a lot of stuff we can do there, some very simple things, right? I've recommended this to my president and to other presidents of universities, right? I think it's important for the places that produce the grad the grad students who eventually become professors and become professors at places like Seattle University. It's important for those presidents just to say, we want you, right? To go to the places where conservatives are and say, we think it would be important for our classes and for our larger institution for you to be here. We are not a sectarian ideological institution, right? And I do think I meet a lot of students who, some of them, what they do is they say, I'd really wanted to go and be a professor of political theory or political philosophy, but I just don't think Princeton or Yale or Harvard wants me. And they go to law school and they become lawyers, and they get very happy lives, or not so happy lives.
That's a different
lawyers.
Podcast. Yeah.
But I think the first thing is that the people in universities, like presidents, provosts, deans, need to go out there and start just to say that they think that the growth of the sectarian university is a problem, and that there's still something we can do about it. Now, that's not going to change the professoriate really for a decade or a dozen years, but I think that's the stage where we really need to focus most intently.
One mechanism that you talked about in your piece was, the academic center, and I think you mentioned the example of the School of Civic Leadership at UT. You have the center that Robbie George runs at Princeton, the Madison Center. What do you see as the upsides or downsides of that model?
Yeah, so I think that those are two different models, right? So Robert George, you should know, is a brilliant. I was a fellow actually at Robbie's center, and I actually remember. I'll tell a story here. When I first got to Princeton, I was a fellow at Robert George's center, and I was talking to somebody else who was a fellow who I think taught at Villanova, and she asked me who I was, and I was like, "Oh, I'm Steve Teles," and she goes, "Oh, you're the affirmative action guy," and I was like, "Oh yeah, I'd written on affirmative action." She goes, "Oh no, you were the one who was supposed to be here for ideological diversity, because I was supposed to be the left of the Madison program," and Robbie George is well-known sort of Catholic social conservative. So what they mostly do is they bring in visiting speakers, they bring in visiting fellows. Some of them teach the students, but they don't produce degrees, they don't do admissions, they don't do anything. I mean, what's new is, especially at red state universities like University of Texas, Ohio State is creating one of these schools. University of Tennessee is, Florida under Ben Sass started one. Is they're creating whole new schools with faculty with tenure that are admitting students there, and they're doing, they have slightly different names. Some are civic studies, some are civic leadership. They're all civic something. And I'm ambivalent about this, right? I understand the problem that caused us to want to create these institutions. And the number of the people I know are running them. Justin Dyer is the dean at University of Texas, and he's a very serious scholar, and I think he's trying to create a genuinely pluralistic institution there. All of these schools are having to do this complicated thing where the thing that caused them to come into being was because, the state legislature got fed up, right? And they were like, somebody ought to do something. And this is something. This is the thing that people have sort of come up with as an idea. And it's supposed to be mostly for undergraduates, and it's supposed to train people in civics, but broadly, not civics like you would do it in ninth grade, but civics in a broadly understood, focused mostly on political philosophy and history. I have a couple of issues with it, right? One is, I think the skills we need for civic leadership are broader than just political philosophy and history. I actually think social science is a critical, set of those skills for, it's impossible to be a citizen in modern America and not have a basic understanding of probability, right? So much of the basic questions, when you think about all the things we went through for COVID, right? How was it possible to understand any of those questions without understanding some basic principles of statistics? So part of it is that. And part of it is, I would like us to clean our own house, right? In the core disciplines of the university, to make it so that we don't have to necessarily just create parallel institutions which have the risk of becoming their own kind of ghetto. Now, I think they might not turn out to be that way, right? They might turn out to be pluralist institutions that bring together people from the whole university. And so in some ways, they're a microcosm in one place of what the whole university should be. but we don't know yet what those are going to turn out to be. Now, again, I know most of the people who are deans of those, and they're really serious people, and we'll see how much they can do that in the political environment in which they're working.
Thanks. Okay, one last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. And there are microphones here. Please use the microphones on either side of the room if you have a question. And think about your question as I'm asking my last question. Otherwise, we get that awkward silence.
I know. Here's the killer one, though. This is like...
Well, no, this is a simple one. It kind of connects us to some of the other speakers this year. But what do you see a role that technology or social media has played in the closing of the university mind over the last couple of decades, or are these kind of just different phenomena operating in parallel?
Yeah, so they're going to be smarter people than me on this subject, but I'll mention one part of it, right? One part of social media is we often see the dumbest version of the argument on the other side, right? We don't see, the ideal. This goes back to the idea about having, real serious conservative professors teaching you, right? Is that you are faced with the strongest embodied version of the argument that is, different than yours, right? In the world of social media, we usually see the opposite. We see the dumbest version, right? That's the one that people distribute around. That's the thing that gets passed around through social media. And so I do think that, the world that we have and the institutions we create should try to counter that dynamic, again, which I think is a deeply institutionalized dynamic in social media. And we should try as much as possible to inoculate ourselves from that. This is the thing people often call nut picking, where they try and pick the dumbest version for some argument in order to knock it down, whereas the logic of liberal arts education is to always be confronted with the strongest version of the argument that's on the other side. And so that's where I think, it's a tragedy if our institutions fall into the logic of this other information processing system that's represented by social media.
And now, questions from our audience.
Thank you very much. You had mentioned early on that one of the real problems in achieving ideological diversity amongst faculty is that there's not a welcoming or nurturing community for conservative scholars. Not that they're going to take over the faculty senate, but that they don't feel comfortable. And I'm curious, and you said that it sounded like you implied that there's something endemic in our culture that, left to its own devices, academia would be left-leaning. And I'm curious if that's a position you have, and if so, why is that? Why is it left-leaning? Why don't we have the problem with conservative universities nationwide worried about academic diversity, intellectual diversity, thinking about ways to make liberals feel more comfortable?
So first of all, there aren't that many of them, right? There's a few of them, right? There's
Hillsdale.
Grove City, there's Hillsdale. You run through the list pretty quick. And I would not, for the most part, recommend that conservatives go to institutions like that, because it's important for them to, and again, there's actually been some really interesting studies recently that show that, conservatives can, pass, the ideological Turing test, the ability to explain the other side's argument as faithfully as possible, that they can do that better than liberal students are able to give the version of the conservative argument.
This is that Lauren Wright.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting piece. I definitely Google it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still waiting. To be honest, I'm waiting for the replication of that study. So I want to put an error term around my level of confidence in that study. But I think there's something to it, and it resonates with my own experience. But again, most conservatives go to institutions that are not mostly liberal in their orientation of their professors. And again, for me, the important thing is the ethos of the institution. And this is where the things that are not happening on campus are often are not happening in the classroom, are as important or way more important than what happens in the classroom. And that's why, again, when you look at the fact that there's been an ideological shift in the natural sciences, right? That suggests it's something in the university community writ large, not necessarily in their disciplines, that's causing people who are on the right to self-select out of that. And that's where you start getting to things like student life and even just the role that religion plays in the university experience, right? And whether or not that's considered to be weird and kooky, right? There's plenty of of serious Catholic natural science, people who want to go into natural sciences, but if they think that the places they're going to go and try and raise families and make a life are going to be mostly hostile to religion, then they're going to be, I should do something else. So I do think that there's something about the overall culture. Again, this is where I would distinguish liberalism as a ideology or philosophy and liberalism as a culture, or to use the term vibes that everyone's doing now. And I actually think there's a lot universities can do on the culture side that's separate from what they're doing on the pedagogical side.
I do think there's a reason universities tend to lean left, and we'll talk about it offline. I was just asked this question a week ago for another podcast, and I have a theory that totally unsupported by empiricism about why there are more left-leaning universities than right-leaning. But was one interesting thing.
That's the benefit of being a law professor. You don't need any of that.
I don't need facts. FIRE just came out with its ranking of the kind of health of discourse on different campuses, and one of the interesting things you mentioned, Hillsdale. They had 5 schools where it was kind of eroding significantly, and 4 of them were what I would consider to be, I think 3 or 4, I would consider to be fairly conservative. Hillsdale, I think one was Liberty.
Yeah.
So there were a few, because if you're trying to maintain ideological conformity on your campus, the discourse is going to suffer whichever ideology you're promoting. Melvin?
Yeah, very interesting conversation and thoughts, but being a little older, this feels to me more like if you would have took your studies back or your comments back 20 years before where you started, you probably started with a much more conservative base that were leaving other people out. And then that base had to come up with a whole series of answers, sort of what you're talking about, what the conservatives are trying to do now. So I'm trying to understand what are we getting? What are we really trying to get at? Are we saying that, part of it you're saying conservatives are not in the place because they're selecting out. Part of you're saying they're not being selected in. But as a country, we've been through this before where a whole bunch of liberals weren't in at all, and the universities were very conservative.
So more broadly, one thing I wanted to touch on here is, universities have in some ways been very good at bringing certain kind of people who are outside the university in, right? There's been a lot of commitment to racial and gender diversity.
Not that long. That history is pretty short.
Yeah, well, okay, right. But the
let's not get very short compared to the lifespan of the country. Let's not give them much credit there.
Yeah, no. So, and now one thing I'll say is it's simply empirically the case that project has pushed the university to the left, right? That's not a normative point. But
because it didn't have anywhere to go right.
But let me just try and nail this point down because it's a kind of complicated point, and I'm not sure I quite got it. Yeah, I quite figured this out yet, right? But but that's partially because in diversifying our institutions on the basis of race, right? We did that actually by selecting a somewhat unrepresentative set of people out of African Americans. So when you think about this, right, when you do surveys, the most religious community in the United States are African Americans, right? But that's not true of the people who get selected to go into academia, right? And so the tension in universities, when I talk about this in universities, people often say, well, there's a tension between trying to diversify your institution ideologically and diversifying it racially. And I think that's true if we're diversifying our institutions racially by selecting out, right, the most left of center part of that community, right? But I actually think that when in trying to diversify your institutions ideologically, we should be doing so by reaching out to the more conservative, religious parts of the African American and Hispanic and other communities who actually are in some ways quite conservative, but they're not the kind of people who get selected and tapped on the shoulder and encouraged to go into academia.
Well, I'm going to make two more points and let somebody else have it. One, I'll make the point that as many poor whites and women got into colleges and into institutions based on the changes that you described were made to allow African Americans to go in. So you can't go past that. As many, probably more, because I was in that group of kids. And number two, the one that I really wanted to highlight, but I can't spend too much time on it, your housing comments. I think you should go back just a little bit and understand the reason why they had to build public housing or low-cost housing is they tore down all of the neighborhoods to build freeways. So you can't start at the point you started with and fully understand the problem. I actually lived in a house that got tore down to build the Dan Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
And then people would say, well, why do you need housing? Well, because the government just walked in and said, we're going to buy your house. We don't care where you live.
I'd go back even further than that because before you built the freeways, you had Dan Ryan is in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
You had racially restrictive covenants covering about 80% of the housing in Chicago. So and then that's where they built the freeways. So, I mean, it goes back, and there's a great book called The Color of Law that looks at the history of zoning and kind of connects it with the history. I don't want to get too deep into the land use thing here, but I think you keep going back. I mean, the housing is, I mean, I think the basic point is no matter what your view is on where to start, you benefit from an empirical perspective that is trying to figure out what the consequences are of this or that policy intervention today. But do you want to comment on
I mean, hey, I could go all the way down the rabbit hole on the housing thing. The thing that's interesting is the exact moment when we started making things like racial covenants illegal, right? So one thing, if we think of all the things that happen at the same time, right? One is there's a lot of, urban renewal, housing construction that ended up, very systematically going through the places that were most politically unable to defend themselves, which were communities largely of African Americans and others, right? Once we did that, and then we got rid of racially exclusive covenants. But then what we did is we created all kind of new mechanisms, right, that made it harder to build housing. And we ended up creating in lots of these places this enormous housing deficit, especially in places that are growing like Seattle, San Francisco, DC, New York, right? Where we never ended up building housing to go and replace a lot of the housing that got torn down. And then that is really a part of the crisis that all the cities like us are facing. But we could get all the way down to the original cause of
the only thing you keep going back to, at the same time that they were building houses for poor African Americans, as many or more housing was built on the public dole for poor whites. You can't escape that part. I have a big family history in Kentucky. I know what was going on. So to me, if we're going to really look at the picture, let's just say the whole underclass got underserved.
Right.
Because I could tell you, and even on the south side of Chicago, people don't know it, but there were white housing projects.
Yep.
So let's not just say it was for, it's either liberal or conservative, but you can't say it was African American.
Right. I understand.
So thanks for joining me for this land use podcast. I love it. I should do that. That would be so much fun. But we could go all the way down that rabbit hole. But one interesting thing that brings out is when I was teaching at the University of Chicago, I would sort of lean away from my class, and so when I moved there from Cornell, my class tended to be very left wing. I couldn't get people to sort of voice libertarian arguments in my property class, and so I would voice them, and then in my student evaluations, they would call me conservative. And then when I went to the University of Chicago, everyone was talking about libertarian property theory, and so I would talk about racially restrictive covenants, and then my student evaluations were like, man, this guy's obsessed with race. So it was just really, I guess that makes me a liberal institutionalist. Any other? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been fascinating to listen to you. So I'm also a former alumni at Seattle University. Just 2 years ago, my experience is a bit different. I'm one of the reasons I was actually scared to join Seattle University for reasons of religion and stuff like that, but turned out to be one of the faculty or literature or education that I really enjoyed much more than the computer science that I was taking, because it challenged me to ask questions about life, about ethics, about society, and so on. But I think maybe the question for as a culture and as a society right now is less about having more conservatives in schools, but more about, because I recently did my civics test on when I was applying for my citizenship here. The same test that I passed, when I asked many American peers, they failed. So America has maybe an issue of over STEM, because that's, the digital age culture, and less of humanity and civics. So, and I've traveled much of the country. I was in Jackson, Wyoming, and there were schools that were more liberal than I could be, because, I'm part of my identity is being Muslim, immigrant, Black, all of that. They were more liberal for me than I thought. And I found more conservative views and ideas here in Seattle, in my community college. An econ teacher telling me colonization helped Africans improve their life. So there were all of these different scales across the country. But one thing I find challenging to sort of with your views is that when you go to universities and other institutions, you find the statistics, male professors and male, what are they called, tenure professors, and people who are leading the labs and all of that. With the challenge with people who are coming up is that when we can't find a lot of people who look like us, first of all, and it wouldn't necessarily matter more than the ideological that you mentioned, but sometimes there's violence attached to that. A lot of women getting abused in the workspace and in universities and so on. So I guess, would you say that it's less about having more conservative teachers and maybe actually educating where are all of these conservative people coming from if all the universities are liberal? This is the challenge, right? So I think it's about teaching people humanity and ethics and so on, just like what Seattle University is doing. And I promise you, this is not a PR for SU, but it really helped my life. It really helped me question about ethics and philosophy and so on. So this is my point, and I think maybe slightly agree with you, but also I find it challenging that it's only lack of professors who are conservative and more about the educational and the curriculum in the universities.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. One thing that I was doing, and I encourage you to look at the underlying piece here, because a lot of, and I always joke that the publication I published in was National Affairs, which comes out of the American Enterprise Institute, and I joke that I was the first person to be able to publish an article on structural racism in National Affairs, because I was really trying to draw on that literature, right? That we know a lot about how durable racial inequality reproduces over time. And it doesn't necessarily reproduce just through discrimination, right? That's the simplest sort of theory of why you end up getting, labs in science, over time, continually being white and male over time. It isn't just discrimination. There's lots of other deeper structural dynamics that produce that sort of reproduction over time. And I think some of that is actually very useful for us understanding these durable, seemingly self-reproducing ideological dynamics. And one of the things I was trying to do in that is I think we often have ideas of who's on what side and how we're, and that these are really exclusive categories, as opposed to, having that instinct toward empathy, right? That we can actually see in our problems, the problems that other people face. And so I wasn't really totally joking about the point that I published a piece about structural racism in National Affairs. That was one of the things I was trying to do, is to get conservatives to say, look, I think this way of thinking is actually quite useful for you understanding your problems. But in the process, you should also understand that actually this structural racism approach actually has a lot to it. There's a lot of empirical, it makes a lot of sense. And that we have a lot to learn from each other, as opposed to just thinking of each other as adversaries in some sort of zero-sum conflict.
Great. Last question.
This has been a very interesting and informative presentation, but I've been thinking during the whole time of how would you define the primary characteristics of conservatism, the conservatives that you're talking about on campus? I mean, how do I really know whether a person is conservative within the context of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, conservatism is not a perpetual philosophy. It's not the same over time. Conservatism is always, on the one hand, the best version of conservatism is attached to some institution, right? It has something that it wants to preserve and transmit, right? And so conservatism, as I understand it, right, is most people, the old line is, everybody's conservative about the institution they care about the most, right? That is, they want to keep it going and transmit it and pass something along, right? And, real conservatism like that is not being reactionary, right? Being a reactionary is an effort to go back to a thing that no longer exists, right? It's not about nurturing an institution that's an organic thing, which also has to change, in order to remain the thing it is, right? And so I think, conservatives, I know lots of people in the military, right? They're conservatives. In part, they have a sort of ideological belief about the role of the United States, and but they also have a care about that institution that is the Army or the Navy, and its traditions and its habits and its institutions. And the same thing is true in churches, right? That, again, these are things that, again, real conservatives know that they have to change in order to continue to be in a kind of continuity with the past. Now, again, there's versions of that are, libertarians are not necessarily conservatives in that sense, right? In one sense, they're radical liberals of a particular kind. But I think in some ways it's that conservatism. The other thing I would say about conservatives is they're often skeptical of large projects of transformation based on abstractions. And that's where I think they're often useful at pushing back against often very abstract ideas that people, in particular on the left, have, right? They're the ones who can often helpfully say, well, what happens if you do that? Have you really thought this all the way through, right? How are individuals going to react to this big system of transformation you want, right? Again, that was the conservatism that I grew up with. It's not necessarily the conservatism that is most characteristic of people who are on Fox News or that one of our presidential candidates has today. But the last thing I'll say is one of the most important reasons to care about preserving conservatism as part of the conversation that's in universities, right, is if we want a better version of conservatism out there in society, right, it's got to start somewhere, right? right? They're often people who have conservative instincts. If they don't get trained and read the classics of conservatism and have to think through their ideology, I would say they'll be like latchkey kids who are left at home with Turning Point and Fox News, right? Would you rather have our conservatives trained that way or trained by people who actually can mentor them to be the best version of that ideology?
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much for being here with us.
To learn more, please visit seattleu.edu. And don't forget to subscribe to our show where you listen to podcasts. Editing for this podcast has been provided by Unify Creative Agency. This interview was recorded on Wednesday, September 11th, 2024.